Well, firstly, thanks for having me. I'm going to talk about how you get XLAs into contracts, really. And as I said, that's been a growth area over the last probably 18 months, 2 years or so. Just very quickly, just for those who don't know me, so my name's Keating. I work for a company called Brighthorse. We're purely focused on experience management. We focus on employee or customer experience, particularly focus on experience level agreements. We're based in the UK, as you can tell by my thick London accent, probably, but we've got offices in the US, and the work we do is global, really. So really what we try and do is help organizations change the way that they measure and report the success of IT by enabling them to do that based on employee experience and experience level agreements. So moving beyond the traditional metrics of SLAs into something else as well. So we do education, assessments. Most of our time is in consultancy, spending time with customers building XLAs and putting them into contracts, really. So that's who I am. I won't sort of dwell on that anymore. Some of the people I saw, I know a lot of you anyway. So let's get on to what I really wanted to talk about, which is I'm going to give you a very quick reminder of what an XLA is, just to make sure we're all on the same page. I'm going to do a couple of slides. This is not an XLA presentation, but then I really want to go into the important contractual considerations, what's been happening, why bother having them in the contracts at all, and then I've got 4 options that, well, between us actually, myself and the team at Happy Signals, we see going into contracts, and I'm going to present each one of those 4 options and give you some of the pros and cons for those, and I'll talk about penalties and reward and maybe how governance might need to change as well. So quite a lot to get through, really. So let me just start with this, really. So why can't people just stick with SLAs? What's wrong with that? We've been doing that for 30, 40, 50 plus years now. And what's wrong with just having SLAs in the contracts like we've always done? Well, I guess nothing is particularly wrong with SLAs. We're not saying that they're a bad thing or anything. They're actually a good thing. They're a great quantitative measure of what we now call operational data. You heard Osvaldo talking about O data there a few minutes ago. So SLAs are a great quantitative measurement of O data. They tell us what to do and they check whether we did it. So pick up the phone, respond to tickets, resolve tickets, keep servers up. The problem is we're now in what we call the experience economy, and that means we need more than just SLAs and KPIs. We need more than just these outputs. And SLAs on their own don't equal happiness. You know, we've all been there. We've achieved every single SLA in the book, but we work out that people in our organization still don't like us because we're not doing the moments that matter for people. We're not doing things that matter for the business. So we need something else as well. So SLAs aren't going to cut it anymore, and we need something more than just SLAs. We need to move from, you can see, I heard Patty and Sammy talking about it this morning, from the watermelon type reports that often we've been reporting into now what we call a lime, which is, of course, we want to achieve our SLAs and KPIs, but we also want to make sure we're delivering what's right for the business and people are getting value from what we're doing as well. So we move from the watermelon to the lime, and that's really the XLA structure. So what is that XLA? Well, SLAs are a measure of outputs, telling you what to do. And an XLA is the measure of your outcomes, your experience ambitions, the things that you want people to have from you, the needs that they've got to enable them to do their jobs, innovation, productivity, efficiency, whatever it might be. It's a measure of their outcome. So to do that, we've got to ask people how they feel. You can't have an XLA without that. So we're going to have to ask people how they feel using Happy Signals to understand, you know, the sentiment. How do people feel about certain things? How do they feel about the service desk? How do they feel about meeting rooms? How do they feel about Office 365? But the problem we have with that is it just sometimes tells us part of the situation. It tells us what people feel, and we might want to understand why they feel that way as well. So the XLA structure brings together all those other data points, SLAs, KPIs, O data and T data, to give us that rounded view. And just to show you the breadth of what it is, this is the XLA stack model. This is what most organizations that we work with in XLAs are putting in place. They're putting in place the version of this XLA stack model, which shows what the experience ambition. That's the outcome we're trying to achieve, the defined area that we're trying to measure. It might be the meeting rooms we're trying to measure. It might be office applications we're trying to measure. It might be business applications that we're trying to measure. But let's define that area and let's write down the experience we want to give people. That's the ambition. And then we've got to find X data. How do people feel about those particular aspects? How do they feel we're achieving our ambitions? And that's where the Happy Signals comes in and talks about sentiment, how we're going to gather quality sentiment to understand happiness and understand how people feel. But if we match that to O data and T data, it gives us that rounded view. And it's the bridging of the data that absolutely matters. So you're bridging it vertically, so the questions bridge to the operational and technical data, but bridging it horizontally as well, how all the measures apply and can matter to experience. It's about bringing these data points together at the right time to measure experience. So if that's what an XLA really is, and that's what most customers are putting in place, well, then we've got to think about contracts. And we've been putting XLAs into contracts probably a lot over the last 18 months or so. Interestingly, before that, most MSPs and customers didn't really put them into contract. It was much more of an informal measure, really. And let's do this just to prove the success of what we're doing. But now we're seeing 2 out of every 3 tenders mention experience level agreements. They need to be contracted. And to be fair, most MSPs don't mind them being contracted as well because it helps their organization too. And I'll come back to that. But when we started doing this 2018 or so, we learned the hard way. The first contract we put in place, we thought it'd be fairly straightforward, but we actually learned the model of an XLA is much bigger than the model of an SLA and technical measures that we've been used to taking, which is why I showed you that XLA stack. You've now got to consider lots more than just an SLA target. We've got to consider the XLA ambitions. We've got to think about how we're going to gather questions and the sentiment. We've got to think about what SLAs matter to that experience. And we've got to think about what technical measures matter to that experience. So it's a lot bigger, it takes a lot more thought. It can create a lot more work in a contractual measure. And the other things we need to think about, which you've really got to consider when you put them into a contract, is experience is cumulative. This is not like an SLA where we typically take a snapshot at the end of the month and say, hey, how was that? Or we did a 90% target there. We achieved on average 89% of our targets. Okay, what's the improvement? And let's look at it next month. This is cumulative. This is happening all the time. So it's not just about 1 month snapshot. This is a multiple moments in time. So we've got to think about what happened in January and February and March and April and May. And it's the trajectory that matters, not just the single snapshot. Another point that we learned the hard way when we first put these into contracts is experience is horizontal. You can't outsource entirely experience. The company, you are responsible for some of that experience as well. You can outsource some of the delivery of that experience, but it's a joint commitment between you and your supplier or suppliers. They're all responsible for delivering elements of that experience. So now you've got to work out, well, what are my responsibilities and what are their responsibilities? So you both need to work together to do that, and that needs to be thought through in a contract as well. And the last point, really, a key observation is that please remember XLAs are much more dynamic than SLAs and KPIs. When I was working in MSPs, we rarely changed SLAs and KPIs. They were in the contract to start with, and they stayed in the contract for 5 years, and we never changed them. And if we did, it went through some huge contract change process. XLAs will change. Experience ambitions change. You might meet some. You might find the business changes slight direction. The metrics underneath that might change. Things that you thought were important are less important. The things you didn't think were important might become important. So it's a much more dynamic environment, and you need to build that into your contract so you don't have to go through huge contractual changes every time you change a measure or change an ambition. But let's just think for a moment. Why bother doing this at all? What's the point in delivering XLAs in contracts? Well, firstly, as I said, lots of companies are doing this informally. Let's prove the point to you. And in a lot of cases, that works. But I guess as a matter of maturity, as we're seeing more XLAs being defined, and as we're seeing more people measuring experience, and as we're seeing that XLAs will be the de facto way to measure service by 2025, I think that was a Gartner stat there. It probably should be contractualized. It probably should be in the tenders. It should be in the contract. Now, most customers want this because it helps them understand. It's in the requirements. It's in their tender, and so they ought to put it into the contract. Most procurement teams will say, well, if it's in the tender, let's make sure it's in the contract. And to be fair, as I said, most suppliers will welcome this as well because it makes it clear what their responsibilities are. It makes it clear what they're responsible for, what the customer is responsible for. And it also helps their business, extensions, renewals, customer closeness. If they're going to deliver proper outcomes, then they're going to get closer to the customer, and that's going to help their organization as well. So it's good for both the customer and it's good for the suppliers as well. But as this is still fairly new to lots of people, of course, there's going to be some nervousness about that. And remember what I said, this is about a joint commitment. So we've really got to document who's going to do what in the contract. So we need to be clear. Who's going to do parts of each element of it? When are they going to do it? Is it going to be done monthly? Is it going to be done quarterly? What tools are we going to use to do that? Who's responsible for these elements of the XLA, these technical measures? Who's responsible for the SLA measures? Who's responsible for gathering the sentiment measures? How are we going to report that? How often are we going to do that? And what's that report look like? And we really need to start documenting out all of those aspects in the contract, really. And we need to be careful. So it should go in the contract. It's a step of maturity. I welcome it going into contracts, but we just need to be careful that we don't go down the wrong paths that we did with SLAs and KPIs as well. Because to measure experience properly, we need a culture and an environment that's about openness and collaboration. The moment we start going down the wrong path of that, we move away from that, like we did with SLAs and all the SLAs exceptions we started to report across, and that would drive us away from delivering great experiences and just into contractual measures. So whatever we put in the contract, we need to be careful we don't drive the wrong behavior, and I'll try and touch upon that in a bit. So the things you need to consider. So if you're going to put this into contracts, the areas that you need to consider, firstly, you need to think about what type of XLA have you got in place? Identify the type of XLA, because that's going to determine the type of words you use and the type of commitment that you want from the supplier. So we've got different versions of XLAs. We've built XLA 1.0, which is measuring sentiment as an additional measure. Okay, we're already measuring SLAs and KPIs. We may already have in the contract technical measures, keeping servers up, etc. Maybe we just want in the contract XLA 1.0. We measure sentiment, and we just want you to measure sentiment. But what sentiment? What area are we trying to measure from that? Who's going to do that? And how are we going to do that? Is it going to be Happy Signals that's doing that sentiment measure? So we've got to still document that, even if you're on XLA 1.0 in a contract. If you like a lot of companies and you go to XLA 2.0, which is bridging those multiple data streams together, as Osvaldo was talking there a moment ago about X data and O data and T data and measuring all of those data streams, but it's the bridging of that matters. Well, what are those data points, and which ones am I responsible for delivering, and which ones are you responsible for delivering, and which one maybe even a third party, another supplier is responsible for delivering them? And how do we bring that in that XLA stack model to show the overall the defined commitment, the area that we're trying to measure, our ambition? How do we all show that as a joined up structure? So we've got to think about that a lot deeper as well. So if we're going for XLA 2.0, it's a lot wider. You've also got XLAs around internal companies to their outsourcers. And that, if that's going to be done, we need to be in a contract as well. So how do you feel about the outsourcer you're working with? Are they trustworthy? Do they communicate to you? Do you enjoy working with them? Do they have your backs in a crisis? Are they doing what's right for your business, or are they just doing what's right for the contract? How do you feel about them? Because at the end of the contract, that's going to be an important measure to decide whether you're going to renew that contract. So we should be having that in the contract too. And maybe you want that the other way around. How does your supplier feel about working with you? Are you communicative? Do you help them? Are you flexible, adaptable? Can you work closely together? Maybe you want to learn that from both sides, and we need to document that XLA in the contract if you're going with that one as well. And a lot of what we do now is actually projects. So most new contracts start with big transition programs. You can measure that with experience level agreements. Rather than just time and quality, how well did we deliver that project? Has that project been successful? And that needs to be governed and put into contracts as well. So you need to decide the type of XLA you've got in place, because that's going to think about all the other things I'm now going to say. So your contractual options, and I've got a slide on each one of these, so I'm going to briefly do this on this slide here. But the four we see very common are committing to delivering some form of digital experience score. So DEX will always be above 7.5. Commit to delivering an XLA score. For example, we'll maintain digital workspace experience, or particularly onboarding is a very popular one right now. And we'll commit to delivering an XLA score. So there's two. We also have them people saying, well, let's commit to always improving experience. Experience will always get better. We'll always improve it. We'll go from 6 to 7 or whatever that might be, or at least we'll not make it worse. So we'll keep it a steady state. And then finally, we've got commit to delivering the process, so treating it like a statement of work. Now, I'm going to go through each one of those, and I'm going to give you pros and cons in each one, and hopefully something will resonate and you think, oh, that's the one I need to do. So once you've chosen your XLA type or types, you might have 2 or 3 of those types, Then you've got to think about, well, which option do I really want to have in the contract? So let's think about committing to delivering a DEX score, really. So for those who don't know, DEX stands for digital experience. It's used by a lot of MSPs. There's tools that you need to have in place to do that, but it's easy. If your MSP's got that DEX tool, you can leverage that. So DEX, you can have a score, and it's easy for procurement to think, it's very similar to an SLA. DEX will always be above 80. DEX will always be 75 or whatever it might be. So it's very easy to deliver, and it's very easy to report against it because the tool you've got will tell you the score. And often a DEX score is really important to understand the context as well. So it will help you understand, okay, well, what's gone wrong? What do we need to fix? How do we get from 75 to 80 to 80, from 80 to 85, etc. So they're easy to do, and they're simple to put into contracts, very simple. However, the concern that we have with that is that DEX tools are an investment that need to be made. Maybe your MSPs had already made that and baked that into your contract, so that's a thing you can do with them. But if not, you need to go and buy the tool. And we're now seeing lots of customers buying DEX tools instead of the supplier because they want to be in control of that. If the MSP has the DEX tool, you'll only see what the MSP is allowing you to see. Fair enough, it's their tool. And lots of customers want to have that control themselves. So that's the first problem. That's going to take a time and investment to do that. But also, DEX is really only one part of an XLA. Now, although some DEX include sentiment, what about the O data? What happens if the experience you're trying to measure is wider than just DEX as well? It's only one part of that. What happens if you're trying to measure onboarding or the service desk or the tech bars? Digital experience isn't going to help you do that as much because that's going to be really focused on your O data and your sentiment data. So DEX can be quite limiting. If you only have DEX, you'll only be able to measure things that technically you can measure through that DEX tool, and that won't be some of your operational performance. And also, if you've got DEX, you may need to make sure that is connected to, to happiness and experience data. So if you have a DEX tool and you want to, and that's not doing surveys for you, then you need to make sure you've got happy signals to make sure you are connecting that data to the DEX tool. Then you've got X data and T data. So you need to connect it to other tools that you've got. So we need to be a bit careful with DEX because it's probably going to be limiting for people if you only focus on that particular area. Now, the last point is also important. But those measures can easily be changed. It's a couple of clicks and a mouse to be able to change some of those measures. So we need to make sure if you're going with that measure, make sure you put in really good change control so that we don't end up, missing data points that we really think are important to us. The next one, commit to an XLA score. So this is wider than DEX. So for those people who have gone down the XLA route already, you heard Osvaldo talk about that, then this will be the thing you might be thinking about. This might be the first option you come across, really. So here we're thinking about committing to a score. So our XLA score will always be above 7. Our onboarding score will always be above 8.5, whatever it might be. So it's similar to the DEX score. And so you've got similar pros and cons to that. Again, it's easy. It's how we measure other measures, SLAs and KPIs. So we always have a number, and procurement particularly like a number. So we'll always be above 8 or 80 or whatever the score you might need to do. It's also quite good for benchmarking because you can talk to your MSP and say, well, what's the average score you've got for people in our industry? The legal score or the hospital score or whatever it might be. Might be a good benchmark for your MSP too. What's your average customer score? And that might be how you can benchmark other MSPs. What's your average customer score against their average customer score? So it's quite a useful measure, and it's particularly quite a useful measure in the short term. So we'll commit to the score. We want to get to 7.5 or something along those lines. However, the problem we see with just having this as an XLA score is, remember this, the XMO, as Osvaldo was talking about, the XMO is always trying to find areas with poor experience. So that's going to change throughout a 5-year contract. You might find you're delivering an XLA around the service desk, and maybe that's good enough now. And maybe we're now going to go and find define an XLA around the tech bar, or go and find an XLA around device management. And therefore, experience is naturally going to go up, and it's naturally going to fall, because you're now finding an area of poor experience. You're going to bring that back up. So we need to make sure that we are not just focused in one particular area, and therefore just committing to a score is going to be problematic for us. And sometimes that score and things can change beyond the circumstances of the MSP or the supplier. The pandemic, for example, shot IT performance through the roof. Everyone loved IT at that point. The cost of living crisis now might mean that people have poor experiences because they're in a state of mind that might affect that. So some things are outside of the control. So it's good for the short term, but not necessarily good for the long term. So we need to think about others. So maybe we want to think about committing to overall improving experience. So, or at least let's say never degrading experience. So we'll always have XLAs above a certain score. So we'll always improve by, I don't know, 5%, or we'll improve by, get to a score of 7 in 6 or 12 months' time. Now, this is a good thing to do, but it's again good for the short term. So it's really good for a project activity. We start off our outsourcing, and we want to make sure we've baselined, we've benchmarked, and we know where we are. And now let's in the next 6 months say we'll get from 5 to 6, and then 6 to 7. So again, good in the short term. But all those things I just talked about, the dynamic nature of finding new areas to measure, and just really focusing on that one score could cause you problems in the longer term. And actually, in the longer term, it's harder to go from, improving from 5% from 80 is much harder than going from 10% to 50. So if you're delivering poor experience, it's easy to improve. If you're delivering good enough experience, it's quite hard to improve. So this commitment gets harder and harder as we go through. Finally, this is the one we recommend. So if you're going to go with putting things into contracts, our recommended option is to treat XLAs like a statement of work. Commit all parties to delivering the process and focus less on the score. Because in our experience, focusing on behavior enables better relationships. So yes, you're not going to focus so much on it has to be 70 or 7.5, but you're going to focus on the behavior and the relationship and getting people to do what they ought to be doing and doing things that's right for your business. And that, we think, will drive better scores in the first place. So this is the most common one we put into contracts. This is what we've worked on most in organizations. And you need to agree with all parties who's going to do what, when they're going to do it, what they're going to do, what measures they're responsible for, what measures you're responsible for, and document the process and then feed that back to everybody. Because then you can say, we're responsible for these things, you're responsible for these things, but together, a joint commitment, by doing those things, we achieve our overall ambition. So our advice is focus on a statement of work, XLA, so document the process and commit to that in a contract, not just about scores, because scores will change and fluctuate, and you'll have to go through change control to do that. So just be very careful with that, but focus on this one would be my recommendation. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about these, but in the white paper I did with Happy Signals, there's more information about this. Procurement love penalties and rewards. We've done that for 50 years. We want financial incentives. We want penalties for poor performance. My advice is don't let procurement run your IT service. We try and avoid this as much as we possibly can, because penalties and rewards drive the wrong behavior. When I was working in MSPs, we would build the cost of the penalties into the contract, so the customer was paying for that anyway. It doesn't drive the right behavior. It doesn't enable us to work collaboratively together. So if there's going to be some consequence, try and avoid penalties and rewards. Maybe think about some other areas, individual rewards, or more or less controls, or more or less projects, or more or less references matter to MSPs. Think about those as consequences as rewards or rewards, rather than saying we're going to penalize you for poor performance or we're going to reward you for good performance. So I recognize there needs to be something in there, but maybe focus on the bottom ones rather than financial ones, because financial ones will drive the wrong behavior, and it's driven the wrong behavior for 50 years. So I try and avoid this if possible at all. And however, if you must do it, and some people must do it because their procurement are telling you must, don't try and come up with some complicated structure that's new to everybody. Keep with maybe what you've got. And I put this down because, as we share these afterwards, you maybe think about what you've already got. You've already got SLA penalties in your contract already. So maybe use those as the measure. So if SLAs are not met, but XLAs are, and they're improving things, then maybe suspend those SLA penalties. So nothing, just, okay, we're not going to charge you anything because you're actually improving experience. But if SLAs are not met, and XLAs are static or degrading, then yeah, you need to pay us those penalties. That's fair enough. You pay us those SLA penalties. Don't double charge, just use the SLA penalties you've got in there. But if SLAs are met and XLAs are improving, then reward them as you would have done with your SLAs. If SLAs are met and XLAs are static, i.e. not going anywhere, then maybe there's no penalty reward again. So we're keeping that very stable. But if SLAs are met and XLAs are degrading, then pay the penalties. So use what you've got already as a mechanism to reward or penalize people if you must do it. My advice is don't do it, but if you must, there's an option for you to think about and amend according to your needs. And lastly, I just wanted to cover in the time I've got contractual governance as well, because of all those things I've just talked about, how you get them into contracts, the options you've got for putting them into contracts, those 4 options I went through, and the penalties and rewards. Then the last thing you need to consider, really, if you go through all of those and choose your step, choose your XLA type, understand what you're there to deliver, choose then the commitment you're going to put into the contract out of those 4 options I've given you, decide whether you're going to put SLAs and penalties in there or not, put that in the contract. But then you need to think about this as well, because this also needs to change. We need to be, if we're going to measure experience, we need to be much more collaborative and much more open. And you're sure you'll hear that as a theme of today as well. You need to bring in all your suppliers collaboratively together into a meeting to talk about governance of experience. You still want to meet them separately, of course, to talk about other things. But when you're thinking about the experience, you need to collectively do this. And you need to consider things like the changes you might need to make. You might achieve an ambition. You might need to change an ambition. XI questions might need to change. You might use a different happy signals survey to find new data for you, to find new areas of experience that you need to measure. The O data and T data might change. The scores and weights might change. And you need to do this collaboratively and openly with your suppliers, because you're always looking to find new areas of experience that you can learn something new and you can improve an experience somewhere else. So once you've got one area to be good enough state, find another. And therefore, we need to do this openly and collaboratively, and it needs to change from what we've been doing for the last 20 years as well.